Good afternoon, friends. I come back after a hiatus of about 5 to 6 weeks, I think, to a discussion of books that I have read in recent months, or perhaps in some cases in previous years, but books that I turn to every now and then, and that I have thought desirable to bring to the attention of everyone else. So, what can be seen in some ways as the initiation of the second series of talks, videos, book talks, I will like to begin today with a book by Michel-Rolph Trouillot, Silencing the Past, Power, and the Production of History. This is a book published in 1995. It's authored, as I said, by Michel-Rolph Trouillot, and it's published by Beacon Press. Now, this is a book, I thought it would be interesting to begin with this book because this is a book which is partly, not entirely about Haiti. It's a book about Haiti, it's a book about slavery, it's about the production of historical discourses, the place of power and the place of silence in these discourses. And why do I think it's apt to begin with this? Because as I'm sure all of you are aware, Haiti has been back in the news owing to a series of unfortunate circumstances over the course of the last 5 to 6 weeks. So I think it was around a month ago, perhaps 5 weeks ago, that the president of Haiti was assassinated. It's not important at this juncture to think about whether that was a coup or something else. And then, as I'm sure many of you are aware, this unfortunate nation went through an earthquake. There was an earthquake in Haiti, a devastating earthquake over a decade ago, and in fact, the blog that I run, vinelal.wordpress.com, one of the earliest essays on that blog, which I think dates back to about 2009 or so, was actually an essay on an earthquake that had taken place in Haiti with an absolutely devastating toll. I think it was something in the neighborhood of around 100,000, perhaps more. Now, I said unfortunate nation because Haiti has had a very, very checkered history, and it has been not only at the mercy of nature, it has been at the mercy of Western powers. But as I said, this is not a book only or even preeminently about Haiti. It is about the Haitian Revolution. And I'd like to begin with that because, let's be honest, how many of those of you who are listening to this really have heard about the Haitian Revolution and know something in concrete about this? Right? What the author of this book, he's too modest to really put it in these words, what the author of this book thinks and what I think, namely that this is perhaps almost certainly maybe the greatest revolution that we've had thus far. And yet there is virtually no mention of it in scores of even textbooks. Right? You can look at world histories and very few of them mention it. Scholars are making amends now, and some people think that it's in the wake of BLM, Black Lives Matter, that perhaps some changes in textbooks might really come about. I'm not so optimistic about that outcome. And then, of course, we'd have to discuss the nature of those changes. But this is simply to say that one of the subjects of this book is the Haitian Revolution as unthinkable. But before we get to that, let us look at the title, Silencing the Past, Power, and the Production of History. Now, if you had to put it in layman's language, you could say that, well, it seems that the terrain of the book is people who have been missing from history. So, if you look, for example, at the early generation of work done in women's history, the first real wave, let's say beginning in the 60s. Much of that work was focused on ensuring that women were brought back into the narrative of history, right? And so if you look at it from a layman's perspective, it seems that this book is probably about that. It's because it's about silencing the past, and which kinds of voices were silenced from the past, who is missing from the historical narrative, right? Another way of putting it is that from the layman's account, from the common standpoint, this would seem to be a book which is perhaps making an assertion or a claim that much of what passes for history is the narrative that has come to us from the victor, those who won, right? Those who vanquished the other. But I think this book is really not about something as simple as that. We do know, of course, that victors shape the narrative much as they shape the course of justice very often, right? We should think about the metaphysics of silence. And this might be one of the grounds for a critique of the book as well, because I think that in the contemporary discourse, both academic and popular, the idea of silence has come under attack. So, we think about, for example, what is the Me Too movement about? Partly what the Me Too movement is about, of course, is ensuring that women whose voices were silenced, women who were the victims of sexual harassment, sexual assault, rape, and who had a legitimate fear of speaking about that these women were therefore silenced. And so the attempt is to ensure that those who have been silenced can speak now, right? That's the dominant mode in which we think about the category of silence today. But there is, of course, a much richer metaphysics of silence. And the question will be whether that could become the grounds of a critique of this book as well. But that's a meta-level critique. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that, for example, we must remember that it is not only important to remember things, right? Remember atrocities, and therefore in remembering them honor the victims, as it were, and to ensure that we shall not commit these atrocities again, right? That's the whole narrative about Holocaust Remembrance Day, right? But there is also, at the same time, an ethics of forgetting. Why sometimes it is important to forget. And similarly, there is an ethics of silence. What is the Buddha's silence about, after all, right? The Buddha's silence is about the ethics of silence under certain circumstances in certain kinds of situations. Now, I said it could become the basis of a critique, but in fact, I think that Trouillot, who is an Haitian anthropologist, was, perhaps I should use the past tense because he died some years ago. Unfortunately, I think he was only in his late 50s. He was a well-known Haitian scholar settled in the United States. He worked in the anthropology department at Johns Hopkins University. But I think that Trouillot is I think, well aware of some of the implications, perhaps not all of the implications of what we might call a much richer discourse of silence. But this talk is not really intended to offer a meta-critique of that. It's a talk which is meant to give us an appreciation of the exceedingly critical, important arguments that he advances. It's a very, very fine work, eloquently written, relatively short, and demanding. It's philosophically demanding to some degree, historiographically demanding as well. Right? Now, what is Trouillot setting out to do? The meat of the book is chapter 3. And the chapter 3 is a chapter which is a chapter called An Unthinkable History, the Haitian Revolution as a Non-Event. But before we get to that, let us look at some other aspects of the book, and then we'll go at the end of my talk to this particular chapter, right? So the Haitian Revolution is a revolution that took place in the early 1790s. Haiti was a slave colony. And this book, as I've said, though it is not a book about slavery, also has insights into slavery, because perforce to speak about the Haitian Revolution is to speak also about the resistance to slavery. Right? Now, the Haitian Revolution is extremely significant because it led to the creation of the first free black republic in the world. And dare I say it, I don't think Trouillot says that. Dare I say it, I think that black people have never been forgiven by the Christian West, the white Christian West, for having dared to initiate the first free black republic in the world. And Haiti is still paying the price. Now, some of you think, by the way, that I might be exaggerating when I tell you that Haiti was paying reparations to France for 150 years after the revolution ended. For 150 years, Haiti was to pay reparations, because when the revolution took place, the French aristocratic plantation class, right, the land-owning plantation owners there, were stripped of their wealth. And this is, of course, why Haiti was going to be compelled to pay reparations, right? But this is the importance of this revolution. It sets up the first free black republic in the world. It brings the discourse of race to the forefront. Okay? In its wake, there were going to be other slave rebellions, including some in the United States, for example, in the area around New Orleans. Right? And of course, one of the other things it did was it extended some of the ideas of the French Revolution and the American Declaration of Independence. What the Haitian Revolution did was it tested the limits of the French Revolution and the American War of Independence. Right? And we know that the American War of Independence was very much what we can describe as a bourgeois revolution. Right? To use the old Marxist category, right? When I use the word bourgeois, but if we don't want to use that word, think of it simply this way: that, as I'm sure many of you are aware, that the United States was not a country that guaranteed universal rights to everyone. It only guaranteed rights initially to land-owning, propertied white men, not just all white men, but propertied white men, fundamentally, right? And then it is over a very long period of time, that other constituencies are eventually going to be added to those who have rights as a citizen, and so on. Of course, there are other problems with the French Revolution as well, which are not addressed by the Haitian Revolution, one of which is that the French Revolution, again, had a very anthropocentric view of the world, right? So, the whole declaration of the rights of man and citizen, and the only critique there is not simply that man, it was meant strictly as man, that is the male of the species, not in the more generic sense of man as when we use the word to refer to human beings, right? That was one of the limitations of the French Revolution. But notwithstanding that, and the fact that in many ways the Haitian Revolution imbibed some of the spirit of the French Revolution, right, and the American Declaration of Independence, it at the same time also extended the idea of universal rights. That is, that the very idea of universal is going to get extended, and these rights are now going to be extended, of course, to black people, to black men. Right? So these are some of the things that we have to think about in connection with the Haitian Revolution. Now, what Trouillot does is that in the first two chapters, he basically has what we might describe as more of a theoretical, not heavily theoretical, but nonetheless theoretical discussion of history, the discourse of history, who produces the discourse of history, What is the relationship between power and the production of discourse? And what is the relationship between scholarship? So he's also interested in the role of historians and scholars more generally. What is the relationship between scholarship and political responsibility, right? And what is the nature of power? Right? And one of the arguments that he makes, it's an argument that Foucault had advanced in his own language, where you might recall that one of the things that Foucault had said about power was that power, really the way it is distributed through the pores of society, capillary, right? That in some ways it almost becomes invisible. And this is one of the central tenets that Trouillot is working with, is that the ultimate mark of power may in fact actually be its invisibility. Now, Trouillot has a particular investment in a certain kind of discourse of history. So to that extent, as he sets out in the preface, he's also critiquing two of the positions. And we have to remember this book is being written in the mid-1990s, when postmodernism was in some ways part of the language of a lot of people working in the humanities, especially, and to some extent in the social sciences. So the two discourses that he wants to at the same time critique are, one is a critique of postmodernism, right? He critiques the standpoint from which they write, questions their conviction that one need not actually have any conviction, that one need not actually think about the roots, because if you take the postmodern view, right, then everything dissolves in air. Everything that is solid melts in air, to use that phrase from Marx himself, and then becomes the title of a famous book by Marshall Berman, right? So he critiques the postmodern writing of history, right? But he also critiques the kind of triumphant worldview that you could see in the writings of people like Francis Fukuyama. I'm going to sort of put it boldly, I don't think he has enough contempt, because maybe Trouillot is too decent a person, and enough contempt for the point of view that was put forward by someone like Francis Fukuyama when he wrote about the end of history, right? Because, I mean, probably one of the most banal arguments that one had heard, but this was a view that he had put forward after the breakup of the Soviet Union, at which point it seemed that now we had achieved the end of history, because now it was very clear that the free market ideology would triumph everywhere, and all of us human beings would now be fulfilled, because we could all become good consumers, since we were now going to be living, no matter where we were, under the sign of the free market ideology. And the second aspect of his argument about, of course, the end of history was, the triumph of liberalism, the triumph of the idea that the individual as a bearer of rights, in the way in which they had been described by theorists, political theorists such as John Locke and others, that this was the apotheosis of history, that now every individual would in a way be able to live a fulfilled life, because once the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Warsaw Pact had been, decimated, Eastern Europe, countries that were satellites of the Soviet Union, had broken free, the Iron Curtain had disappeared. Now this was the end to which everyone was destined to become. The individual would become the bearer of rights, and a certain conception of liberal humanism would now become the dominant model, Fukuyama was convinced, all over the world, right? And the failure of his thinking is not simply what's transpiring now and what has transpired in the course of the last 20 years. It's just that to think that this is in fact actually all that human beings are destined to do, is to become the bearer of rights, including the right to go and shop at Walmart till you drop dead, right? Be a good consumer, live under the sign of the free market ideology. It shows just the poverty of that school of thought, right? So Trouillot is going to critique that, right? That is implicit. He has an explicit statement about that, but that is implicit really throughout the work. Now, there are some very interesting questions that he poses in the first two chapters. I just take a couple of them and then move quickly to chapter 3 and to what in some ways is the central idea that I want to discuss that emerges from my reading of this book. But what are some of these other ideas? So one is that he, for example, asks a very interesting question, right? And that question is, why is both the symbolic relevance of slavery as trauma and the analytical relevance of slavery as social historical explanation so much more prevalent today in the US than in the Caribbean, right? Why is it, let me translate this into a simpler language in some ways. Why is it that when we think about slavery that most people really think about slavery in the US? And it's useful to keep in mind that the United States, contrary to this common view that has developed, or contrary to it, was far from being the largest slave importing colony or place in the New World. There are approximately 10 million. The number could be 11, 12, 13, but we're taking a figure of around 10 to 11 million people. Approximately 10 to 11 slaves were imported into the New World. And by far the largest importer was Brazil, slightly less than 4 million slaves. The Caribbean as a whole had a little over 4 million slaves that they imported. And it is very interesting, as Trouillot himself points out, that the island of Martinique, a small, tiny island in the French Caribbean, imported more slaves than the colonies on the eastern seaboard of the United States. That is a fact, right? And I emphasize that is a fact also because one of the arguments that Trouillot makes in this book is that it's not simply that certain interpretations are silenced. Certain facts themselves are silenced. That is to say, historical facts are not equal. You see, for someone who comes from the positivist worldview, that seems like a strange remark. A fact is a fact and all facts are the same. Well, all facts are not equal because facts themselves occupy a certain place in the discourse. So therefore, we have to see how discourses themselves are produced. Right? That is one of the arguments that Trouillot is making in this book. And so when we go back to the question of slavery, then the question is that why is it that somehow when we think of slavery, we only think of the United States? Of course, scholars of slavery have a more complex view. They're well aware of the slavery in the rest of the New World in Brazil. And then, of course, there are scholars who are even aware of slavery in the ancient world. Right? And there have been large studies done of slavery all around the world. I mean, Orlando Patterson being one among many others who had done such a study. Right? So the question here is that somehow this socio-historical phenomenon of slavery becomes associated with the United States in particular ways. Right? And is that partly because, and I think that this question can be pushed further. I don't think Trouillot devotes, has exhausted the discussion by far. It's not the main point of the book in any case, so therefore I wouldn't critique him for it. But I think that he has not by any stretch of the imagination exhausted this discussion. I think one of the reasons for that, of course, is that the United States in many ways monopolizes the world's imagination. Right? It monopolizes the world's imagination. So whatever happens here becomes the template for how we think about many phenomena and many historical events. It is also the case that relative to other black people, that African Americans certainly have more power. Whatever the extent to which they themselves are oppressed, of course, in the United States, a subject to which I shall turn in I think a week or two when I discuss a book called Slavery by Another Name, a very powerful book. But nonetheless, I think that the point that I'm making here should be quite transparent to almost everyone, that there is a manner in which, of course, the African American has a presence which is denied to black people in the Caribbean, in popular imagination, in a historical discourse, and much else. So now let me turn then finally to chapter 3, the unthinkable, right? An unthinkable history, the Haitian Revolution as a non-event. So the Haitian Revolution breaks out in 1790. And what Trouillot says is very simply this in the first instance. It is a non-event. It is as if it never happened. As if it never happened. Page 88. Let me turn to the end of his discussion and then I'll go back. Right? Page 88, he says, in 1791, there is no public debate on the record in France, in England, or in the United States on the right of black slaves to achieve self-determination and the right to do so by way of armed resistance. End quote. Right? No public record. Such a extraordinary event, right? A revolution by slaves, a rebellion wrought by them, which led to the creation of a first free black republic in the world, and there is no public record of any discussion of this event. That is what Trouillot is arguing. This is what he means when he says it was a non-event. This is the silencing of the past. But let us go back. So one of the most interesting ways in which he begins this particular chapter is he looks at a letter written by a Frenchman to his wife back home in France. Page 72. In 1790, and I quote, just a few months before the beginning of the insurrection that shook Santo Domingue and brought about the revolutionary birth of independent Haiti, French colonist Labarre reassured his metropolitan wife of the peaceful state of life in the tropics. He wrote, quote, "There is no movement among our Negroes." That is that. You see, he's writing this because the French Revolution had taken place in 1789, and so there was some kind of apprehension that, well, maybe people in Haiti might also get inspired. And he's saying there is no movement to his wife. Right? No concern. You need not have any concern. They don't even think of it. They are very tranquil and obedient. A revolt among them is impossible. Impossible. This is just months before the insurrection would break out. Right? Why is it impossible? Let's think about that. But let me continue with the quote, and then I come back to that question. We have nothing to fear on the part of the Negroes. They are tranquil and obedient. So you might say that's one answer. We have nothing to fear. Why is it impossible? Because these people, the Negroes, the black people, they're tranquil and obedient. But that begs the question, why are they tranquil and obedient? And again, he says, once again, the Negroes, quote, are very obedient and always will be. We sleep with doors and windows wide open. Freedom for Negroes is a chimera, an illusion. You see, the reason why they are obedient is not simply because they are whipped into submission. That's part of the story, perhaps. They're obedient and they're peaceful because, genetically speaking, the Negro cannot have an aspiration for freedom. The black man, the black woman doesn't understand what freedom is. It is not intrinsic to their being as it is intrinsic to the being of those who come from Western civilization. Right? That is what he is saying. So he couldn't envision the possibility that an insurrection could actually break out. And this is what Trouillot is really riveted on, is this idea. And what he's going to argue is that the greatest European thinkers, the most celebrated people, likewise think as the French colonist that he cites does, that black people have no aspiration for freedom. This is not part of their imaginary at all. Right? And Voltaire and Diderot and all these great figures were just as complicit in that view as anyone else. Voltaire, incidentally, was an enormous racist. I mean, those who, many celebrated historians, I won't mention names here, who have celebrated the virtues of the Enlightenment and all of that, they should read what Voltaire, for example, wrote about the Slavic people, right? Because people like Voltaire, Diderot, many others, they all thought of the Slavs as half human, right? But you can understand what they thought about black people. And of course, there are people who sometimes will object to slavery on moral grounds, but might agree to it on practical grounds. And then those who objected on practical grounds, but that is that it's not economically profitable, for example, right? And not very many, of course, who took that view, but objected to it on moral grounds. But there is no European thinker really of any stature who really objected to slavery as such, right? And therefore, also, any European thinker who could take the view that black people actually, just like people anywhere else, had an aspiration for freedom, desired liberty, right? This is what the subject matter of the book is. This is why I think it's a very important book. I'm going to just read out one more passage, and that will bring me to the conclusion of my discussion, right? And this is a passage taken from pages 78 to 79. I read it out, right? In the name of freedom and democracy, also in July 1789, so this is before the Haitian Revolution had started, just a few days before the storming of the Bastille, the French Revolution was taking place. A few planters from Santo Domingo met in Paris to petition the newly formed French Assembly to accept in its midst 20 representatives from the Caribbean, right? Clear enough, because a new assembly after the French Revolution was going to be formed, and these planters wanted representation, 20 representatives, that it would be 20 white representatives, French representatives from the Caribbean, that the French Caribbean should be represented in the French Assembly. The planters had derived this number from the population of the islands, using roughly the mathematics used in France to proportion metropolitan representatives in the Assembly. But they had quite advertently counted the black slaves and the gens de couleur, that is, the free people of color, as part of the population of the islands. Whereas, of course, they were claiming no rights of suffrage for those non-whites. That is, that these black people in Haiti and the French Caribbean, elsewhere, were not going to obviously have the rights of citizens. They were slaves, but they were being counted using the same formula of representation right? They were being counted, and the claim was that because there are so many slaves there, therefore the number of representatives, French representatives from the Caribbean, should be such and such number, right? And now Trouillot continues. Gabriel Riquetti, Count of Mirabeau, took the stand to denounce the planters' skewed mathematics. Mirabeau told the assembly, and I quote, "Are the colonies placing their Negroes and their gens de couleur in the class of men or in that of the beasts of burden? Which column have you put," he says, "these black people in? Free people of color, or in the column of beasts of burden? If the colonist wants the Negroes and gens de couleur to count as men, let them enfranchise the first, that all may be electors, that all may be elected. If not, we beg them to observe that in proportioning the number of deputies to the population of France, we have taken into consideration neither the number of our horses nor that of our mules." End quote. This is the view of the Enlightenment. And I think it is the most telling indictment of what the Western project, not only of slavery, but of creating universal discourse for everyone, right? It is an indictment of that discourse that we have to seriously interrogate the idea of what was the Enlightenment as well. I would simply conclude by saying that when the Haitian Revolution becomes as much of the part of the history of the world as the French Revolution or the American War of Independence, then I dare say another revolution itself would have been created. Thank you.